minutes, probably a minute or two past 8 o'clock, just to give everyone plenty of time to join us. So while we're waiting, if I'd love to just hear where you're watching from tonight. If you want to open chat, say hello there. I'd also love to know if you're in lockdown, like many of us, what's something that's been inspiring you to get creative during lockdown? So, if anything.
Well, I'll kick off. Hi, Dean. Don.
Hello, Don.
Hi, Dean. From Adelaide, South Australia. We're not in lockdown. We can't travel. Well, we can travel interstate. We just can't get back again. So we're able to get out freely. And actually, it's been a good, I suppose, inspiration to look for images in one local area rather than traveling to different places. So
Yeah.
it's been quite stimulating, really.
Very good.
Someone from Pottsville, a great spot at northern New South Wales. Absolutely love Pottsville.
That's me.
Awesome. I actually had a holiday booked in the school holidays with my two girls in September, but unfortunately I wasn't able to go. But I'll be back in Pottsville in January.
Oh, good. Look forward to seeing you.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, that's right. When the border opens. Yeah.
Yeah. It's from Melbourne.
Hey, Dean.
Hello. How are you?
Good. I just wanted to let you know I've got you on live stream attached to the telly, so
Okay.
so we've got a bigger screen. So I'm going to put it all on unmute and turn the camera off and stuff.
Okay. No worries.
No worries.
Enjoy.
If you're just joining us, please open chat. Let us know where you're watching from, and if you're in lockdown, I'd love to hear something that's been inspiring you to get creative as well. Pop that in chat just to get us started, and we'll probably kick off in about 1 or 2 minutes.
Hello, Shirley. Margaret.
Hi guys, I'm Shane. I'm from Sydney.
Okay, Shane.
Hi, I'm John Green from Point Lonsdale, Victoria.
Oh, awesome. Okay. Lots of people from Victoria joining us.
Lockdown.
Yeah.
Yeah.
G'day, Dean. It's Rob from the Essendon Camera Club. We caught up a couple of weeks ago.
Yes. G'day, Rob.
How are you?
Good.
Excellent. Just keep my fingers crossed for the October.
I was just going to say that for our workshop.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi everyone, it's Neil from Bramwell Street, just round the corner from Dean.
Should be shooting in his land room.
Excellent. All right. Well, we might get kicked off. We've got about 130 in the Zoom room, so we've got a good turnout so far, and there's still people coming in. Guys, just a bit of housekeeping before I get started. Once Dean starts presenting, if you can just make sure you're on mute for us, just so we don't hear any background noise and everyone can hear Dean clearly. That would be wonderful. If you're interested in something that Dean may mention tonight or one of our other products, we've got 20% off at the moment. It's a lockdown sale that has been on a few months, considering we've been locked down for a very long time now in Sydney. But it will end at the end of September. So there's only a very limited time for this promo, and it's a great time to buy at a great price. So please consider checking out one of our brands there, and particularly anything that Dean might mention tonight about Nissi. Feel free to jump on nissifilters.com.au and check that out.
I've finally been able to join. Thank you.
I'd just like to now introduce Dean. Dean is an amazing photographer and teacher. I know many people that have been to his workshops, and they've told me just how much they have absolutely loved them. Dean is super creative in the way he teaches. He does some really cool workshops and little shoots where he invites people to come along with him when he's shooting as well, and to really take them to the spots that Dean loves to travel and loves to experience. Dean's also written some great ebooks as well. So if you jump on Dean's website after the event, you'll be able to check out one of Dean's ebooks. He's very, very knowledgeable, and the books are fantastic and well written. And I think you're really going to enjoy tonight. Dean loves shooting seascapes. He lives not far from the sea in regional Victoria, and you'll see plenty of shots from there tonight, I'm sure, and you're in for a treat. So I might pass over to Dean.
No worries. Thank you, Andrew. I'll just share my screen. Go back to the start. Okay, well, let's get going. Firstly, thank you everyone for joining. Great to see some familiar faces there, and yeah, haven't been out doing many workshops this year. I normally run quite a few workshops, and I think I've only managed 2 to Flinders Island, so a little bit disappointing, but anyway, it is what it is. So look, tonight I want to touch on a very small part of composition, and I've always sort of felt that composition is the key to you know, really any genre of photography. And sometimes I think these days it's maybe sort of forgotten a little bit. With, you know, we have so many tools available to us with editing. Sometimes we sort of think more on the editing side rather than actually composing the image, you know, properly and getting a strong image right from the start. So yeah, Andrew's right. I do shoot a lot of seascapes, and I've sort of, you know, I've lived by the sea for a long time, and I just sort of love the ocean. So I guess that has sort of become my speciality. And so tonight I want to just, as I said, I want to touch on one small part of it, and that is picking the right foreground for the style of image that you're going to shoot. And I've sort of realised over the last couple of years, what I'm about to show you, I can't say I've done it deliberately myself, but I look back over my images, and when I sort of analyse them, I realise what I'm doing subconsciously, I guess. So I've sort of come up with this bit of a formula that you can use in picking the right foreground for the right style of image. And I am really big on foregrounds with my images. If for those of you that do follow me and you've seen the stuff, you probably know that a lot of times the whole image is just the foreground, nothing else. So yeah, to me, the foreground really is king, and it can really sort of make or break an image. And, you know, unfortunately, you know, a lot of us don't, you know, we don't pay enough attention to the actual foreground. We find the subject, we know what we're going to shoot, but then we don't think about everything else. So I'm going to break this down tonight into a few different sections, and then what I'll do is at the end of each section, I'll open up for some questions. And I think that may work better rather than waiting right to the very end for anybody that wants to ask a question. So firstly, I'm going to talk about elements within an image, and then I've broken the style of image that I shoot, or that we can shoot, into 6 different situations or 6 different scenarios, and they will be vertical or horizontal. And then for each of those, we have 3 different applications where the foreground may be the complete subject, or the subject is in the midground, or the subject is way off in the distance. Okay, so let's just start with elements, and I want to talk about how to recognize elements within an image and how to break your image into those elements. And this is really important. And the reason why I'm starting with this is because if you're not breaking it down into elements, then your composition is not going to work, and it sort of makes it harder to get that foreground right. So here we've got an image, and let me just break this down into its elements. So firstly, I just want to say, normally I won't call the ocean and the sky an element, because they pretty much are given with a seascape image. We're always going to have the ocean in it, and we're always going to have the sky. So I'm looking for other parts or other elements that are within the frame. Now, in saying that, if I do have an image where the sky is a very integral part, then I will classify that as an element. And some images, a couple tonight, I think you'll see, actually I've got one coming up, where the ocean or the water is a very strong part of it, then that would be classified as an element. So with this particular image here, I'm breaking it up into two pretty clear sort of distinct elements. Number one is the jetty. And so that was actually my subject. That's what I was photographing. So there's element number one, and the foreground rock is number two. So two elements in that one. Okay, so that was a vertical image. So this is a horizontal image. And in this one, again, I'm just breaking this down into two elements. So our set of three rocks is one element. And just with that, like that's one element, it's not three elements. Even though it's three rocks, the rocks are the same color, the same texture. They're sort of the same, not exactly the same shape, but they are grouped as a set of rocks or a group of rocks. There's no other rocks sort of around it. So when you can group a set of rocks or a cluster of rocks, then I classify that as one element. And of course, with this one, we've got an incoming wave. It's coming in very fast, and I've shot this at half a second. I think it's half a second or 1 second, to create these lines that are coming towards me. And that's obviously a very strong key part of the image. So I'm classifying that as an element as well. Okay, so just move into something a little bit more, getting sort of a little bit more complex. So here we've got a few different things happening. So let's just break this down into its elements. So here I'm looking at 4 different elements. And what dictates an element is its color, texture, tone, shape. So obviously, number one, we've got this bush in the rock that's completely different to everything else. And then number 2 is one rock ledge that is all the same sort of texture and tone. And then over at number 3, we've got a different set of rocks, different textures, slightly different tones, and a completely different part of the image. And then the set of rocks over on the left-hand side, number 4, these again sort of differ from 2 and 3. So here we've got 4 different elements. And as I said, the ocean and the sky, I'm not sort of counting those in as elements with these style of images. Okay, so let's have a look at this one. So we've got a vertical image. This one's, the subject is in the foreground. So let's just break it down into its elements. So here I've got 4 different elements. Number 1 is the color and the texture of the seaweed on the rock down at the bottom. Now, number 2, so I'm calling that rock on the right and the one on the left, I'm calling that one element, or it's the same because it's the same color, texture, it's the same sort of tones, and it differs from the rock that's at number 3 and the rock that's at number 4. So even though where you can have rocks that may sit in different places, if they are exactly the same, then you can take that as one element. And then, as I said, 3 is different again, and then 4 it's very similar to 3, but we've got some very different shapes that sort of stand out compared to the ones over on the right-hand side. So I'm classifying that as 4 elements. And it's really important that you do, I really encourage you to learn to break your images down into elements and to look at everything that's in the picture, because later on, as we get towards the end of this presentation, I'll show you how to then arrange these elements within the frame to create the composition. So if you're not aware of what the elements are, then it can be very hard to get a composition that works. So as you can see with all of those, I think the most I ever had was 4. So the trick is to keep your elements. I'll just flick back over the other one. So there was 4 in that one. There's only 2 in that one, and there's only 2 in that one. So it's a case of where, less is more. And I'll just show you what happens when you have too many elements. So let's just have a look at this image here. As much as it's a pleasing image, it's sort of a bit of a record shot, and there's nothing really here that does jump out at me. And I did take this picture, by the way, too. I haven't used someone else's. So I do still have some that I take and then look back and go, no, that didn't work. It's too much happening in here. And that's exactly what's happening here. Is it's just way, way too much. Whereas the previous images you saw, you could see that it's very definite what the subject is and what the picture's all about. So let's just have a look at what's going on in here. So here I'm picking up, or I can break this into 8 different elements. So we've got 8 very different things happening within the frame. So I'll quickly just go through and explain how I've separated all of these. So 1, we've got the rocky shore of the river down in here. That's one texture. It's also a shape. Number 2, we've got a rock sitting in the river that really stands out, and it's very, very different. Over at 3, we've got this rocky cluster here, and even though 4 is sitting right next to it, it's rocks, but you've got foliage in there as well. So you can see 3 and 4 are very different. Let's come back. So that is very different to that. So if that foliage wasn't there, then you could have called that whole rock ledge one element, but it's not. It changes very much. So it becomes another part of the image, or another part of the frame that we have to digest and take in. And then, okay, so up at 5, we've got this tree. We've got the tree trunk that's sort of standing out there by itself. And then 6, we've got the poplars with, a completely different colour and different texture. So that stands out by itself. And then over at 7, we've got this grove of trees that are all vertical lines. And then 8, we've got an overhanging branch that is sort of coming into the frame and creating another element. So the other way that you can look at this to recognize elements is to break your image down into tones, textures, shapes, patterns. Like I would approach this scene, and if I was composing an image down here, I'm looking at everything as a texture, whether it's what shape it's creating. Trees are creating vertical lines, so they become lines. Rocks become shapes. The rocky shore becomes a texture. The river is another texture. So rather than looking at it as a river scene with trees and rocks and whatever, break it down into what actually creates an image, and that is tone, texture, color, shape, whatever you can sort of break it down into. And by doing that, you will it'll teach you to recognize elements and then hopefully, sort of how to put them all together. Okay, so that's it for elements. We're going to move on to some images next in the foreground. So does anyone have any questions about that section about elements?
Yes, Dean.
Yeah.
Do you use any filters for these images?
Yes, I certainly do. In the next sections, I've got all of that information in them. So
Right.
everything pretty much, well, except that river shot that I showed you at the end. I don't think I had any filters for that one. That was quite an old shot that I sort of dug up. But everything else has been shot with NISI filters. And the next slides that come up, I'll have all that information. I've got the metadata that'll show you the shutter speed and the f-stop, the ISO. And I've also put in what filters I've used, and I'll talk a little bit more about those filters in the next parts coming up.
Thank you.
Can I just take you back to the messy photograph that you've just shown us?
Yeah.
If you were going back to do it again, how would you reframe it this time?
Yeah. Hang on. Try and get back. Hang on.
Dean, that's someone else has just asked that same question as well. So it'd be great to hear.
Yep.
Yeah.
So what I would do here, I would approach it and, well, firstly, and I'm sort of about to, well, I'll talk about this at the end actually about constructing an image. But the first thing I do is I recognize what is my subject, like what am I taking this photo of? And, within this image here, I'd probably say it would either be maybe number 6 if those trees were maybe a little bit more in a little bit more colour foliage on it, or I would pick one set of trees and then I would pick part of the river. So even over at number sort of 7 and 8, I like that cluster of trees because they're quite strong where they're all vertical lines. And then I could have shot that as probably a vertical image, say from where number 1 is and straight up through there. And actually, if we cut the right-hand side, the right-hand half of the image off, then I've only got 3 elements, haven't I? And, number 8 is not too obtrusive. It's just that, that branch coming in. So I could shoot a vertical through there with the river coming, sort of sweeping around the corner. And then, I'd use the rocky shoreline as a lead into the image, and then I would have those vertical trees at the end. So I think that image there, that's sort of the, one of the probably the nicest part of that frame.
Dean, we've got a few more questions in chat as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, you go first.
Yeah, sorry. Do you think that Impressionist painters of the early 19th century have influenced your style? And do you think there's any influence that could be used today?
I don't know whether they have influenced my style. Who has influenced my style, or who actually changed my style, was photographer Peter Dombrowski. Hopefully lots of you have heard of him. He sadly passed away many years ago, but he was a Tasmanian photographer that shot a lot of the wilderness. And prior to seeing his work, and I mean, I'm going back to the early 2000s, I started my business. I've been doing this for 21 years now. So at the start of my journey with this, I used to just shoot a scene, like it'd be a wide scene. So I would come down and shoot a river like this with sort of so much in it. And the same with coastal stuff is I would shoot, I'd try and shoot the whole beach. So it was always a wide angle, try and get the whole bay in, get as much as you can, and to show that it's a beach and what beach it is in a way. And then I was in Tasmania at the Wilderness Gallery, and he had an exhibition of his work, and I'd heard of him, but I'd never seen his work before. And they had these prints hanging on the wall, and I was absolutely gobsmacked. And the thing that really got me was that I looked at his images and they were all about the foreground. It was all about what was under your feet rather than what was way off in the distance. And that was the stuff that I seem to be focusing on and more worried about, sort of shooting, the beach or the bay that's miles away, where he had a completely different approach. And a lot of his images that I really liked were also vertical, because you just had the stuff right in the foreground that just absolutely jumped out at you. So I remember that day very vividly. That I remember walking out of there, and I think from that day on, I completely changed the way that I shot and the way that I saw things. So yeah, he's definitely had a huge influence on my work.
He has been using
you,
a 4x5 inch camera for most of his work.
No, I shoot full digital now. When I started, say 21 years ago, I was shooting medium format, but it was 6.7. So I was shooting on a Mamiya 7, which is a rangefinder style camera, and it shot 6x7 or 6 centimeters by 7 centimeters. So no, I've never shot 4x5. I've been tempted a few times. And I had a very good friend, Richard White, who sadly, Richard passed away last year. And he was a fantastic black and white photographer who shot 4.5. So no, I've never been down that path, but have been tempted many times.
Thanks, Dean. A couple of questions in chat as well. The first one is, how would you decide which of the elements is the subject? And then a second part to that is there a recommended amount of elements in an image?
Yeah, so I reckon no more than 4 elements.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really matter. Just what happens is, you can see, once you start having 8, there's way too many, and that's what becomes what we refer to as a busy image. There's just too much happening. And when there's too many different things, then what happens is our eye just wanders all over the place because there's no direction. But as far as, okay, we break it into elements, that my approach, and this will come out a little bit later in the presentation, is you recognize your subject first. So the first thing you do is you recognize the subject. Okay, that's what I want to take the photo of, and that's what it's going to be about. And then you recognize, and then you start looking, okay, well, if that's my subject, then what other elements are, around it and within the frame? And then it's a matter of positioning yourself so you can get to a point where you're still focusing on your subject, and your subject is still the key part of the image. But you're then sort of arranging these other elements, and you may be getting rid of some, like, this shot in front of us, I would never shoot this again horizontal because I'm taking in so much. Whereas if I arrive down there now, I'd shoot it vertically to get rid of 4 or 5 different elements and bring it back to sort of 2 or 3. So I think anywhere from 2 to 4 is really good. It's less. And what happens then is your subject becomes very, very obvious because you've only got a couple of strong things in it. So the viewer has no option but to take notice of what you've shot.
Yeah, so I guess it's really about limiting what's in your composition. If you can identify those elements and see them straight away, you can make it simplify that composition very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what it's all about. Simplifying it. And then I'm going to talk about, okay, so we sort of have something that has 3 elements. Then, with the foreground, how do we sort of bring that into then still retain your subject as the key part of the image? And that, and this is where I'm going to talk about selecting the right foreground so as that it doesn't take away from the actual subject. You're actually, your process is to find and identify the subject, and then identify these other elements, and then make these other elements work with the subject, so as that they actually make the subject stand out, and they make the subject very clear what you're trying to show the viewer.
Yeah. Excellent. And one last question I think is appropriate for what you've just discussed is, should you have more than one element, or can you have only one element?
Yeah, you can just have one. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah.
Cool.
It's obviously got to be pretty strong, and everything else has got to be minimalistic. But it's going to certainly. Well, it depends on what it is. I mean, you can have one, but it still comes back to your subject has to be the strongest part of the image. So I wouldn't say you can just have anything, like you can't just pick one thing and go, well, I'm just going to have that. It's got to be strong. But yeah, you can just have one. It can work by itself for sure.
Yeah.
It's probably one of the hardest shots to take. Yeah.
Cool. Well, there's a few more questions I might come back to. We might keep moving if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we're going to start on foregrounds. And as I said earlier, I'm going to talk vertical images and horizontal images. I'm splitting these up because my approach to whether I'm shooting a vertical or a horizontal is completely different to how I treat the foreground and what sort of foreground I will be looking for. And also the main subject also plays a large part in that. So I've basically got 6 different scenarios, and this is not the only 6. I'm just picking, these are 6 very common scenes, I guess you would say, types of scenes that we shoot. But there's certainly many more, but this is probably 6 of the most common ones that we would shoot. So I'm going to look at vertical images where the foreground is the subject. Okay, vertical images where the midground is the subject, or your subject lays in the midground. And then also vertical images where the subject is a long way away or very small. So let's start with vertical images where the foreground is the subject. And this is by far my favorite type of shot to shoot. And I'd probably say that this is sort of like my style, what has become my style. I just really love shooting and stuff where there's nothing, you just got water and ocean in the background. There's nothing there. It's all about the foreground. So the secret with these is that the foreground has to be really strong. Like it's got to hold the viewer's attention. It's really got to have everything sort of happening there right in front of you. And with this style of thing, you want to keep the background pretty plain and simple. You don't want a lot happening in the background, because then what happens is you've got 2 different things happening. You've got this fantastic foreground detail and all the stuff happening right at the start of the image. And then if you've got it at the back as well, then you find what happens is you're jumping from one to the other. So the secret with a composition, or what I try and, I shouldn't say the secret, because I mean, composition is such an open thing, and there's no sort of right or wrong. But with my images, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to lead the viewer to where I want to lead them into the image and sort of hold them there. So I do that by, with these vertical images where it's all about the foreground. I keep the foreground really strong, and I'll keep the background really simple. And that way they're not sort of bouncing from one to the other. And so this shot here, we've got this beautiful foreground, and those rocks that the rocks on the left and the right, sort of the immediate rocks, they just have this beautiful sort of sculptured look to them. And then I have used a 10-stop ND, so I've slowed the shutter speed right down. I remember shooting this, it was a little bit before sunset, so the light's sort of starting to fade a little bit. And I've gone for a really long exposure because I just wanted to get that water nice and milky and get some movement in the clouds, just to sort of add a little bit of dimension there, but not to the point where it draws the viewer away from what's happening in the foreground there. I just want to talk about filters with this one, because if you have a look at my info there, so CPL is a circular polarizer too, for anyone that's not aware of that. So with the polarizer, what that does is the those rocks in the sort of immediate foreground, the bluey green ones, it takes the reflection off that, and it just brings all a beautiful colour out. And also the seaweed, little kelpies, beaded, I don't know what that is, beaded dragon, I think it's called. It brings the colour out in that as well. And you'll also find by using a circular polarizer, even though you sort of don't see it on the day, but it can add some really nice colour to the actual ocean. So if you have a look, you know, sort of along the horizon line, especially on the right-hand side, you'll see some blue coming in there. That's all created by the polarizer. So you can add some nice colour in there without having to sort of add it via saturation or anything like that. So I've used a 10 stop because I wanted that long exposure of 60 seconds to create that milkiness. But just have a look at the two graduated filters I've used. So these are the ones that control the light between the dark and the light part of our image. And I do this a lot. I use two graduated filters, and I find I very rarely come across anyone else that ever uses this technique, but I find it works an absolute treat. So what happens in this situation, if you're shooting a lot of these scenes in low light, and this particular spot where I am, it's along the Great Ocean Road. So the sun sets behind me and it sets behind a hill. So when it does that, and this is probably on a half an hour or 20 minutes or sort of getting close to sunset, then what happens is we still have nice light and good color in the sky and a bit on the ocean, but the foreground is really dark. It's really, really dark. And if I'd shot this without any graduated filters, I would have been wasting my time, because the sky would have been so blown out, and the foreground would have been incredibly dark, and you know, it never would have pulled any sort of information out of it. So what I do with these is I use a 2-stop hard graduated ND filter, and I'll pull that down to the horizon line. And what happens is I still need more graduated filters, like the sky is still a little bit too bright and the foreground is still too dark. So then I'll use the 3-stop medium and I'll pull that down on top of that. And then quite often I will pull it a little bit further down, because where you've got all this white water breaking, that can tend to blow out. So it helps control that white water. And by using those two filters, I've now really toned the sky down, and it's like just throwing a spotlight into your foreground. And that's how I achieve, you know, so much color and detail into the foreground of my images. And it's really important, because a shot like this, you know, it's all about the foreground. So you've got to have the exposure correct in there, and you've got to have the enough light in there. And without those graduated filters, there was no way I could ever get a shot like this. So that's a technique that I use a lot. And I think I've got a couple more through here that I'll just show you where I've used the same thing. So another image here. So what I've got three samples of each of these to show you. So here's another one where, you know, it's, the whole image is all about the foreground. And this is another thing I'd really like to do with my foreground shots, is to find stuff and to break it into really strong shapes. So this was just a rock ledge that sort of came out, and to the left and right of that shot, it went sort of quite wide. So it wasn't these skinny bits poking out, but by positioning my camera as such, and by shooting vertical, then I've created these really strong shapes. So that's another thing you can do with your foregrounds, is to make them really jump out, is to create really strong shapes and patterns. The other thing with that is, what I always look for and try to achieve is the same texture and tone or pattern or whatever. So if you take these two big sort of clumps of rock there, or the reef, it's exactly the same tone. It's the same tone, same texture. So that's sort of less distracting and it's more dynamic. So stuff like that helps a foreground like this really work. Because you imagine that if it was like 4 different types of rock and, you know, there was bits of seaweed here and other stuff there, then you just got too much happening. So it doesn't sort of jump out. And then again, with this one, I've just kept the background really simple. I've gone a long exposure again, 40 seconds, and there's some waves coming in there, which are sort of breaking over that rock that's sitting in the midground. And I've used a circular polarizer. And again, you can see the beautiful greens in there. That's not done digitally, or I haven't done that in Photoshop. That's purely created through the circular polarizer. And I've got some YouTube videos, just getting off track here a little bit, but I've got some YouTube videos on how I edit using adjustment layers and whatever. And so you can have a look at those if you want to sort of see how I edit. And everything's sort of, all the colors and everything are pretty much captured in camera. I don't do a lot of heavy editing to my images. And again, with that one, with the choice of filters, I've used the 10-stop ND. And this one I've used a 2-stop hard graduated, which would have been pulled down onto the horizon line just to tone that sky down. Okay, so third example, again, this one's all about, it's all about the foreground. And again, it's just a matter of finding a foreground where you've got similarities, you know, shapes. You'll notice with this one, even though we've got some difference in texture, but it's sort of like, well, we've got 1, 2, 3. We've still got 4 big shapes. So it's sort of like 4 pieces that are similar in shape. So that sort of holds a foreground together too, where it's not too distracting. And of course, you've got the immediate foreground with the slab there with those little holes that are created. There's quite a few of those in spots that I shoot. So that creates a lot of interest as well. And again, like I'm a big advocate for vertical images. I would shoot 85% verticals to, 85 verticals to 15 horizontals with my seascapes. And one of the main reasons I do that is that you can get rid of, you can declutter an image by shooting vertically. If you imagine a horizontal shot, then because we are looking so wide, we've got a lot more to take in. So there's a lot more chances of having distractions or, other stuff that's different. So it becomes very messy. So when you shoot vertically, you can declutter by eliminating stuff on the sides. And I really sort of like doing that. This one, again, if you have a look at the NISI filters that I've used here, circular polarizer, the 10-stop to create that long shutter speed. And again, I've used a 2-stop hard, which I sit just in the sky, and then a 3-stop median that I pull further down to control the ocean a little bit more and the white water. Okay, and our third image that was the 3. So we're now on to vertical images where we have our subject that's sitting in the midground. So with these, our subject's in the middle of the frame. It's not sort of like too far away. So we need a foreground that can help. I try and use a foreground that then pushes you into the picture. So I'm not looking for a foreground that holds the viewer's attention, because then I'm holding them back from moving into the subject. And with these verticals, think of it as the viewer moving from the bottom of the image and then traveling into the image. And that's the other thing I love about verticals, is it just, to me, it just seems such a natural way of viewing something, that you just look at it and you're just viewing it straight in as if you were standing there looking at the scene yourself. So with this one, you can see the immediate foreground. I've just picked a rock ledge, and that's all the same texture, the same tone. And I've just given it, not too much base, but just enough there to create this base on the image that then pushes you into the subject itself. And then again, when we've got the subject smack bang in the middle, in the midground, then we don't want anything too busy or too much happening way off in the distance. And if we break this image down into its elements, you got one would be in the foreground, and then the middle rock with those two rocks that you could really sort of, if you call those two separate ones, we're looking at three elements at the most. You could possibly call the cloud in the sky an element, because that's quite an integral part as well. But even so, we haven't got all these elements that are creating distractions. Okay, so here's another one where our subject is sort of off in the middle of the frame. And so with this one, I'm creating lines. So I'm using the foreground to create lines. Again, I want to push the viewer, I want to push them into the middle of the frame to look at the subject, what I'm photographing. So again, you can be a little bit bold with it. Like, this is obviously a lot more foreground than the image before, but it still works. I think it's because it's sort of one color tone, so that sort of holds it there, and that helps sort of push into the middle where we've got a little bit more happening. And those lines in those rocks definitely help to sort of push the viewer through as well. With the filters on this, so this type of image, I've just gone the 6-stop ND. I don't have a lot of water. There wasn't a lot of water movement happening in there, so there's no point. Well, not there's no point, but I didn't feel any need to sort of shoot anything really long. I possibly could have to get cloud movement, but I sort of felt I just wanted it to be a little bit more natural. I really like using the 6-stop ND. It's probably one of my favourite NDs for middle of the day. This was shot just after lunchtime, and just to give, like 7 seconds, it just gives that movement in the water to sort of blur that out a little bit and just create that nice look. And it still looks very natural. So you're not getting that sort of streakiness in the sky. And then with that one, I've used the 3-stop medium graduated filter for the sky, because I had a lot of light. You can see that white cloud just sitting above the escarpment there. So the medium graduated filters are probably my favorite ones and the most forgiving ones, because you can pull that down and you can creep it down sort of over that hill a little bit, and it still works perfectly. Okay, let's get this next. Okay, that's our third image for subject in the midground. So again, keep your background sort of fairly simple. In saying that, you can still have some stuff there. Like here, we've got an island way off in the distance. So this is shot on Flinders Island, which is an island off the mainland of Tassie. The one place that I actually managed to run some workshops this year. So yeah, don't be afraid. You don't have to have nothing in the background, but you don't want anything that's too distracting. Remember what your subject is, and for this image, my subject is that round rock in the ocean and the cluster of rocks behind it. So that's the key part of the image. Everything else needs to just help point to that and help sort of balance it out. We don't want to take away from that. And this is where, again, it's so important that you put the right foreground in to complement that and to help make that happen, rather than the foreground become a distraction with it. In this particular image, I've walked out on this exposed rock, and I've set my camera up in a position that creates this nice big sort of triangle shaped rock. And, you know, triangles are fantastic, and I love doing this because it just naturally pushes you into the image. So works perfectly, and you know, this is a perfect type of rock or foreground to use because it's all one tone. It's nice and simple. It's not distracting, and it's not taking away from the image. And if you just sort of use your hand and block that foreground out, then you can see that, no, without it, the whole image becomes a bit sort of simple and a bit bland. So again, you know, to me, the foreground will really complement and really make every image just go to that next sort of step. And it creates depth. What you're trying to do is you're trying to create depth within your image where the viewer actually flows through it. So to do that, you need to direct them. You need to sort of you know, make a very distinct path for them, and you can do that by using the right foreground, such as this. Okay, so just quickly the settings I've got on that. So again, I've used a circular polarizer. I've used a 6-stop ND. I've got 18 seconds on that one, and this was on sort of sunset. So you've got to be careful with metadata, because you can look and go, oh, he's used the 6-stop ND, but he's got 18 seconds, but it depends on the ambient light. So I find you know, which ND I use, whether it be the 3, the 6 or the 10, really depends on what time of day it is, whether it's sunrise, you know, whether it's low light or whether it's the middle of the day. And of course, as we get to the end of the day or the start of the day when the light is very low, then if we want a long shutter speed, we don't need to be putting a 10-stop in. We can just be using a 3 or a 6 to create, you know, a 15, 20 or 30 second exposure time. And the graduated filter I've used on that is, of course, the trusty old 3-stop medium. It's my go-to graduated filter for sure. Okay, so that's 3 examples there of where we have our subject roughly sitting in the midground. So now the last sort of scenario with vertical images that I'm going to go through is where we have the subject way off in the distance. And quite often when that's the case, then the subject is quite small. So let's have a look at what sort of foregrounds I choose for these. So when this is the case, you really need a strong foreground because your subject is quite small and it's not dominating the frame. If we have a look at this shot, I like to sometimes look at an image and I'll pick an element or a subject and I'll relate it back to a percentage of the actual frame. So if we have a look at that whole frame as being 100%, you know, the jetty is really quite small. I don't know what that would be, maybe 5% or something. So it's not a, you know, a large imposing part of your composition. So really to make that work, you've got to put a good foreground in. But the trick is sometimes you don't want the foreground to overpower it. So you've got to make it work as well. And in this case, I'm using this foreground to sort of create some lines that curve around and then, you know, lead the eye into the jetty or the subject that's way off in the distance. And you'll notice if you have a look down in the bottom left-hand corner, and I've been very, very, very obvious about how I've set this composition up to create that really strong line coming out of that corner. And this is another thing, when I compose, I'll take a shot or I'll look at it at the back of the screen, and I'll take in all of these things and I'll place, you know, these elements, and I'll tweak this composition to exactly where I want it. And how I do that is I actually use a geared head. So I don't use a ball head on my tripod. I use a geared head. And so with a geared head, I can make very minute movements to get that composition absolutely perfect. Okay, so settings on this, so I've got 40 seconds, yeah, F11 80 ISO. I've used the 10 stop. This was after sunrise. So I had a sunrise down here at this Point Lonsdale Jetty. And then as the light was sort of kicking in a little bit, I've just found this beautiful reef. And this is like a wave coming over it. So I was very lucky to get that shot. We've been back many times trying to get another one, but it just hasn't happened. Okay, another example here of subject sort of being quite small off in the distance. This is the same jetty, different morning. So with this one, it's a different approach, and you'll notice I've got my horizon in the middle here, because with this one, I would actually count that sky as an element because it's so strong, it's streaky, those lines. I remember shooting this. I remember seeing that there was quite a bit of wind up top and those clouds were moving. So I sort of quickly threw in and again, I've only used the 6 stop because it's at sunrise. It's created a 2-minute exposure. So I was sort of lucky to get this shot. I sort of thought, oh yeah, if I do something really long, I could get some nice streaky clouds up the top. And I was lucky that that is what happened. And so because of that, I'm giving more real estate to the sky because it's becoming more of an integral part of the image. And so again, with this one, the main interest really where we want the viewer to lead is to lead to the jetty and then up into the sky. So again, the foreground, I've kept it really simple, just sort of 3 nice rocks that sort of become stepping stones, and they just help sort of balance the sky out. And again, with that one, I had the sun rising right on the horizon, so that was very bright. So I'd used a 2 stop hard, and I still had a lot of light underneath with a white water, because they were actually waves crashing in through here. So again, I've used that 2 graduated filter technique to sort of tone that down. Okay, and last one for vertical images. So again, this one's a little bit different, and the reason why I picked this one is because you can actually have some interest in the background. And so here we've got that escarpment sort of way off, and so you can put this really interesting foreground in. And again, it's sort of like it's a little bit different. This one, you can almost sort of hold the viewer in the foreground, but it sort of helps balance out. The other thing is with the escarpment in the back is some of those tones are mirrored in the foreground. So that's another thing I like to do when I'm picking a foreground and when I have a background like this. If you can pick up some of the tones that are the same, then it helps it really sort of balance and sit, rather than the 2 being sort of very, very different. Again, and so this one was shot in the middle of the day. I've used a 6 stop because I didn't want a really, really long exposure. I've just created a 3.5 second exposure just to create some movement in that water, because again, the water is not the main subject here. The foreground is, and the escarpment off in the distance. So I didn't sort of really need anything super long. And I've used a 3 stop medium in the sky just to sort of tone that down and to balance that out. Okay, so that's it for vertical images. Have we got any questions on those, or any questions in general?
Dean, there's a bunch of questions that have been in chat, which I might hit you up with now. Asked a couple of times was, do you have a favorite focal length or lens and that most of these images are shot with?
Yep, certainly do. I get asked this all the time. My favorite focal length is 20, like I'm talking full frame here. So on a full frame camera, it's 24 mil. And I've shot that for the last 10 years, I reckon. Every camera system that I have, the first thing I do is I buy a prime lens at that focal length. And and pretty much every single shot you have seen has been shot at that focal length. And why I like it is because it's not too wide. It's sort of like it's the happy medium. It's wide enough, but it's not too wide. And I find it's sort of really weird because I find 27, 28 mil is not wide enough, but 24 is just perfect. So again, I'm not saying that that's right or wrong. It probably comes back more to my style. So because of the style that I shoot and the way I see things, then I find that this focal length works perfectly. The other thing is that all of these images that you're looking at are all shot from my eye height. And I'm tall, I'm 6'2", and I never shoot down low. And again, I'm not saying that that is wrong, but it's just not my style and it's not how I see things. I see things from where I'm standing, and that's where I place my camera. And with these verticals, I just point the camera down a little bit. And the other thing is, with a 24mm lens is that, say this shot that we've got on the screen here, that immediate foreground is just in front of me. It's only a couple of feet in front of me. So I can get right up on top of the bit that I've seen, the interesting part, and I can shoot it. You'll find, I know a lot of landscapers shoot like fairly wide with like 16mm, and they tend to shoot more down low because when you're shooting that wide, you've got to get really, really close to your subject. So they might get right down low and shoot it, and that's all fine. But again, I'm not saying that that is wrong, but it's just not how I see things. And a lot of these were actually also shot on that 15mm lens, Andrew, that the 15mm Nissi, because that's a 24mm. And when you sent that to me, I was just about to go to Flinders Island. That was earlier this year, wasn't it? So I went to Flinders Island, did a workshop, and I put it on the camera, and honestly, it didn't come off once. The first workshop, it never came off the camera. Every single shot was shot on that lens and that focal length because I just love it. Yeah.
For those that don't know, we have a 15mm lens, and it's a full frame mirrorless design lens, but Dean uses it on a crop sensor, which actually turns it into about a 22 to 23, I think, something around there. And it's a really great focal length. One thing I see in your images, Dean, as well, is a lot of photographers shoot with super wide angles, even up to 14 mils. But what that does is that element that is, I guess, towards that mid-ground, it becomes very small. And it's very difficult to make that out in your images when you're that wide.
Yeah. And then the other thing it does is you get distortion on the horizon line. So, and a lot of my shots, like that one you're looking at there, a lot of them have a horizon line. So if you start shooting 16mm and you're pointing it down a bit, then, unless you've got a really, really good lens, you're going to get this distortion and all of that sort of stuff that carries on. It's funny, I remember years and years and years ago, the first I was shooting, I went and bought a 16, it was a 16 to 30, I think, a Sigma lens that went on I can't remember what camera it was, but anyway, it's like, I was so thrilled on getting this really wide angle lens, and I go down the beach and put it on, set it to 16mm, take some shots, and it's like everything's so far away. I was going, oh, geez, this is hopeless. So, there's a real, if you're going to shoot ultra wide, there's a real knack to it. And I think to shoot that wide, you've got to get right down on the ground with it. But 24mm, absolutely love it.
Cool. A couple of other questions about, I guess, how you shoot. Do you shoot with live view and manual focus?
Yes, I do. Yeah, so I use live view, and I use a thing called a Hoodman loop, which I actually sell. So if anybody is not sure about that, they'll find them on my website. So it's a loop that goes over your live view screen, and then you look through it, and so it blocks all the light out. And so when you're shooting during the day, it's very hard to see your screen, and it's actually very hard to compose. And so I always shoot live view, and I'll always use the loop so as I can see exactly what's going on. And with my little tweaks, that's how I can make those little changes, because then I can review it and I can see exactly what I've got and make those changes. And yeah, I always shoot in manual focus mode. In fact, a lot of the lenses I've got, that Nissi lens is the 15mm Nissi is a manual focus, and the Canon system I had prior to the Fuji system that I'm shooting on, I had a Zeiss 25mm, and it was a full manual focus. And you just focus on the barrel. I just do hyperfocal, and if I'm shooting at f8, I just set them up. And again, if anyone wants to learn about that, I've got a YouTube video on how to use hyperfocal to set your focus. And I just do it manually. For anyone that's not, then that's one of the biggest questions I always get asked is where do I place my focus? So with that, as I say, I always use hyperfocal, which will tell me where my focus starts and where it finishes. So I just have to set it so that it finishes at infinity, and then I just read off. And if it's telling me that it's going to start at 3 feet, and I know the closest thing is 5 feet away, then I know everything's going to be in focus. If you can't use that, and a lot of camera systems, it's quite hard to use hyperfocal distance technique, then just focus a third of the way in. Just get your third grid line up and just focus on that bottom third line, and that will and then shoot with an aperture that's sort of down the f8 to f11, f16 end, and you will have everything in focus. It's very, very quick and easy to focus.
That was another question too, Dean.
Yeah.
Someone was looking at your settings and seeing f8, and they're asking, is everything going to be in focus at f8?
Yeah. So that's another thing. And with this metadata that you're looking at, everything shot on the Fuji X series, which is a crop sensor. So those f-stop readings, or those are the f-stop settings that I use, are quite different to when I was shooting on Canon full frame. Because when I was shooting Canon full frame, to get that depth of field, to get everything in focus, I couldn't really go under f11. I would always be f11 or f16. Sometimes I could use f8, I would sort of just sneak it in. But what happens when you go to a crop sensor, so instead of it being a 24mm lens, it's actually a 16mm lens. And what happens is when we go wider with a lens, we get a lot more natural depth of field. So I've found with the Fuji system, geez, I can shoot at 5.6 and get everything in focus simply because of that. So that has also changed the way I shoot, and it's also changed the way I use ND filters. And I've also did some research, and I encourage people to sort of research their lenses and find out where the sweet spot is. And with the Fuji lenses that I use, then the sweet spot is around f5.6. So if I can shoot at 5.6, I will, because everything will be sharper. But then what happens is with the NDs, if I'm shooting at f5.6, then there's quite a bit of light coming in. So quite often I'll need to be using a 10 stop instead of a 6. Well, I actually got your 15 stop, and I bought your 15 stop purely for that, because sometimes if I want to do a 4-minute exposure, then and I don't want to stop it down to f16. I want it at f5.6. So things change for the camera system that you're using.
Yeah, and that's one thing. Teaching workshops with lots of different camera systems, you see that, and micro four thirds cameras, you can get away with an aperture of 5.6 or even f4, and everything will be in focus.
I know,
because of the sensor size.
Yeah. Yeah.
Couple quick ones before we move on to Dean. This is an interesting one that I would really love to know the answer to as well. How do you record what filters that you use for each shot?
Yeah. Okay. So some of it is guesswork, but I can. Okay, so the circular polarizer, I pretty much always use a circular polarizer. So it's always on the camera. And when I say I use it, I don't always, and this is a trick with a polarizer, is it's not a matter of always turning on to where it's actually polarizing. You set it to where you want to get the desired effect that you want. And what can happen with a polarizer is that sometimes it can affect the rocks in the foreground, but not the sky. And then another position, it can affect the sky, but not the rocks in the foreground. So I'll always use the polarizer to get my rocks looking how I want them. With the ND filter, I can always guess because I know whether I was shooting it in low light or middle of the day, and I just know that if it's a 4-second exposure in the middle of the day, then I was using the 6-stop. And then with the graduated filters, I don't have a lot of different ones that I use. I really only use the 2-stop hard. I will use a lot, and the 3-stop medium. And again, I can look at the image, and sometimes I remember. I'll go, yeah, I remember. The light with the foreground was really dark, so I had to use the 2. So I'd say, look, it's pretty accurate with what I've got up there, except sometimes the graduated filters may be just a little bit of a guess.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dean. There's lots of other questions, but we might have to keep moving.
Yeah.
We will definitely go through a bunch of questions at the end as well. So if you want to hang around and ask Dean live, and I will keep a note of these ones in chat and ask Dean towards the end.
Yeah. Okay, so let's look at horizontal images and how I sort of treat the foreground in these. So these, as I said earlier, I treat a horizontal image very, very differently to a vertical image. So with these, I'm looking for like a really strong shape, patterns, repetition, lines, and then we need to sort of keep the background simple. So these are ones where we've got the foreground is the subject. So ones like this, I pick a ledge, and you see that's one big, very definite shape, and it's sort of very similar also in color and texture. So there's not a lot of different things happening here, and this is where it is a lot harder with a horizontal, because we're taking in, there's a lot more happening from left to right. And again, this is why I shoot a lot of verticals, and why when we shoot vertical, we can eliminate distractions and get rid of mess that's sort of on the left and the right, and we can really sort of strengthen things. So horizontal shots are definitely, I find them harder, and I guess less prominent in the landscape that I see through my eyes anyway. So here's another one here. So again, the foreground is our subject. And again, it's important for me to pick a foreground that runs from the left to the right of the frame, where I try and keep the texture, all the same. And you can see it is here. It's all that one type of rock. It's all leaning the one way. And it's the same sort of colors. And, there's a little bit happening in the midground. There's nothing in the background. So you sort of want that foreground to stand out. It's a bit unusual, because with this shot, even though the foreground is a subject, but it's sort of, you take in the whole image as it is. So sometimes it doesn't have to be, like all about the foreground. It's just the way it sort of works. And with these, I've used a 10-stop ND. This is a 2-minute exposure. And again, you can see there, I'm like f5.6. And this was mid-morning from memory. So I've got that long exposure, what that does is that reef that's sort of hidden that you can just see, that really long exposure, I know that when you do that, it brings that out. Whereas if I had a shot at 3 or 4 seconds, then it wouldn't be so obvious. So it just adds that other dimension into your image. You get another one here. This is the same location, actually, just a slightly different area. But we're just taking in a little bit more in the foreground. But again, I've just created that really strong shape from left to right with that curve, and kept that foreground really strong. Midground, it still has some nice interest there. Polarizer has really brought out the greens in the ocean, and it's another 2-minute exposure. So. Okay, horizontal images, and these are where we have the subject is now sort of sitting in the midground. So with these, you need to sort of keep your foreground nice and simple, and you can use lines also to draw towards your subject. So that's what I've done here. I've set this up with my filters. This was shot in the afternoon. So here I've only used a 3-stop ND because I wanted like a 1 second sort of, I was guessing sort of half to 1 second. This is like a really fast wave that come flying in. And I think from memory, I was lucky I sort of got this one of the first shots I took, and then the others didn't really work. So again, you want, you don't want your foreground to overpower your subject. You've got to be really clear about what your subject is. And here I'm using the foreground to lead into the subject. And don't be scared to have some stuff in your background. Like, you can have some elements in the background. The key when that does happen is that you just don't want the background to overpower your subject. Remember, we always come back to what is the subject. And so in this image, it's the really big rock in the middle there. So if we have a background, it just needs to be there to sort of balance the image out. Sometimes we can't avoid it. Where I shot this, I had limited access, and so I couldn't get rid of it. It had to be in the frame. So don't be scared that you should have nothing in the background. Just make sure 2 things. One is that it doesn't overpower your main subject, and also make sure you separate it from the subject. You'll see I have a gap there between the main rock and the escarpment over on the right-hand side, which separates those 2 elements. And then I've just placed that, that simple single rock down in the foreground there to just break that foreground up. I just wanted to have something there, not too much. It's just one element, and it sort of also helps balance that image. Okay, so again, what I like to do with horizontals, if you can fill the whole frame from the left to the right in your foreground with the one texture, the one tone, then it just makes it helps the subject sort of stand out, and you don't have it. You're eliminating distractions, I guess, by filling that area with all of the one color or tone. Okay, and so the last scenario is where we have the subject way off in the distance. So with this one, we need the foreground to be a little bit stronger. And quite often you'll find with this style of image is that the subject or the elements in the background. So here we're down at Point Lonsdale, and we're actually looking through the rip. So this is the opening to Port Phillip Bay. So on the left-hand side, you've got Point Nepean, and on the right-hand side, you've got Point Lonsdale Jetty. So quite often that is actually part of the story. It's sort of telling part of the story of the image. And because that's so small, then with this style of image, I like to put a pretty strong sort of bold foreground in. And again, here you'll see I've sort of tried to fill, the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the frame with the same colour, texture and tone. So that was a long exposure. I sort of really wanted to create the water to be sort of really milky, and there wasn't a lot of movement in the sky, so it's sort of the structure in the sky still held up. And that was shot after sunrise. It was after a sunrise shoot. So again, I've only used the 6-stop ND, but because the light was already fairly low, I've been able to obtain a 40-second exposure. Okay, so again, we've got our subject way off in the distance, and again, the subject is sort of telling part of the story. And this is over in West Australia at Albany, and this is really hard. Like, it was a hard location. There were just not a lot down there to work with, so I just really wanted the foreground here to sort of act as stepping stones leading you into the lighthouse itself. So again, that immediate foreground, or those sort of three big rocks, that set of rocks, they're all sort of one texture, I guess you'd say, and one type of rock. So they sort of sit there as a nice little cluster, and they just sort of acted as some stepping stones to sort of take you into the subject. The other thing you can do is you can use colour and tone to separate your elements. So here we've got the island way off in the distance, and then I've used these foreground rocks, so sort of kept those really big and really bold. And then, the circular polarizer in this one has really sort of brought that colour out. So that colour in the middle then sort of helps separate your two subjects there. And again, because that island off in the distance is quite small, then even though that's the subject, and that is the subject because that's what I was photographing. I didn't go there to photograph those rocks. I saw that island and I wanted to photograph the island. So this is, again, to be clear of what your subject is. And it doesn't always have to be the biggest, boldest part of the image, but what you do is you identify your subject and then you build the composition around that. So I put these foreground rocks in and kept that sort of big and bold, and then I use the color palette of the water to really help sort of separate those two elements. And again, that one, you can really break that foreground down into one big element, and the island is another element. So we've really only got two main elements in there. So again, just keeping it simple, and the less elements, the less distractions. Okay, has anyone got any questions on horizontal images?
There's a bunch in chat, Dean, but I wanted to just see if anyone wanted to ask a question live.
Okay. Yep.
No, that's okay. I will hit you up with some from chat.
Sure.
If flight is changing fast, do you switch from using filters and move to something like bracketing, or do you continue to use filters?
I don't bracket. I find I don't have to when I'm using filters because I'm using graduated filters. The only reason to bracket would be if you've got one area is too bright and the other area is too dark. So I've just always found by using the graduated filters, I can really balance that exposure out, and I can get enough data in a raw file to not have to bracket. So there's certainly some situations where you have lighting scenarios where a graduated filter can't work because of where the light is or what's happening with it. But I just find that really minimal. And I don't like to sort of spend hours editing images, so I don't want to come home with, you know, where I've bracketed 5 different exposures and then have to sort of turn that into one image. I prefer to just do it in camera, and so I might do that once a year, you know, one image a year I may sort of bracket because I just can't get it in camera, but 99.9% of the time I find I really don't have to.
Excellent. Thanks, Dean. Another question, if you had to buy one graduated filter, which one would it be?
Yep, 3-stop medium.
Yeah,
It was
most
quick,
versatile,
wasn't it?
Yep.
And the reason why
Yeah,
is because it's so forgiving. It's, you know, it's
Yep.
between a hard and a soft. So I just find now, since you guys bought those the medium graduated filters out, it's just my go-to filter. And, you know, 9 times out of 10, or probably 95 times out of 100, it's the one that does the job. It's only really a hard grad. Sometimes you've got to have a hard across a horizon line when it's so obvious. So sometimes with that, a medium isn't strong enough on the horizon line. But geez, no, most of the time, the medium just does a brilliant job.
Yeah, it's definitely the most versatile and our best-selling grad filter.
I was going to say, if it's that best-selling one, it would have to be, wouldn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And that's the one that you put in the kit, so that sort of says a lot. Yeah.
Another question about, or 2 questions about calculating exposure times.
Yep.
Do you use a calculator to calculate the exposure time? And the next question someone has is, how do you calculate your exposure time using multiple filters? So 3 filters, as some of your shots are taken with.
Yep. So it doesn't matter how many filters you have on the front, your camera will still meter through that and work it out. So I'm lucky with the Fuji system. I can put a 10-stop filter in and everything. Live view still works perfectly and the meter works perfectly. There are a very small handful of cameras out there that I find on workshops where it doesn't work and then you have to do it all manually. So I just put the filters on and then I let the camera work it out. And if it's going to be under 30 seconds, then the camera works it out and I don't have to do anything. I will then just, I shoot in aperture priority mode. So I'll set my aperture and then the camera will pick the shutter speed. And then I'll look at the histogram and make sure that that is, you know, where I want the histogram to be sitting. And I'll use the exposure compensation dial to change that if I need to tweak that. Now, if I'm doing a 2-minute exposure, I'm sort of lucky because I come from a film background. I know all my stops and I know the maths. So I actually do it. I use a technique in the camera where what I would do is I set, so if I've got my aperture at f8 and so I've got the 10-stop in and it's going to be, say, 2 minutes, but the cameras can only work it out to 30 seconds, can't it? So you've got 30 seconds blinking at you, telling you that it's beyond the camera's capabilities. So what I do is I just keep dialing up the ISO until it tells me I've got 30 seconds. And so then I'll take note of what that ISO is, and then I'll back the ISO back down to where I want it. And then each stop I come down, I would double. So if it was at, say, 800 ISO, 30 seconds, then I'd come down to, I would know that 400 ISO would be 1 minute and 200 ISO would be 2 minutes. So I work it all out in my head, basically. But I would suggest that, no, for a lot of people, they can't do that. So just use an app, just use the NISI app, and that's the quickest, easiest way.
Yeah, excellent. And just another little hint for people, if you're at 30 seconds, the light meter in your camera usually will have 3 stops. So you can see if you're 1, 2, or 3 stops underexposed at 30 seconds and just if it's one stop, you can simply double your exposure time to 60 seconds. So that's an easy way if you're within 3 stops of 30 seconds as well, without having to calculate the exposure time. And we also have an app to calculate it if it's over 30 seconds for people that don't like maths as well.
No, I get plenty on workshops that don't, and plenty of people don't know their stops, how to work that backwards. So yeah, in that case, an app is really easy. But can I just say what I do get a lot is I get a lot of people they'll buy a set of filters off me, or they'll come on a workshop and they'll have a set of filters, and what they don't realize is that you can actually just put them on the front of your camera, and your camera actually just reads through it and it works it all out. You don't actually have to do anything magical. You just it's no different to just screwing a circular polarizer or anything else on the front. It's only once you get beyond that 30 seconds that you have to start working things out manually.
Yeah, but that's also depending on the camera brand. So I shoot Fuji the same as Dean, and my camera will meter up to 60-minute exposure in camera. So I never have to really use a exposure calculator, because I can always just do it on my camera.
Yeah.
So it depends on the brand.
Yeah.
Cool.
Sure.
How much more have you got, Dean? Because we've got heaps of questions still, but I want to make sure you get through your content.
I've just got some composition, constructing the image, which will probably I can go through that in 5-10 minutes.
Cool. Why don't we do that, and we can then come back to a bunch of questions at the end.
Sure. So that's it for those 6 different sort of scenarios of different types of image situations and how I deal with the foreground. So now I just wanted to quickly sort of add this in and show you a bit of a workflow process on actually constructing the image. So the first thing in setting up a composition or constructing the image is find and recognize your subject. And I can't stress this enough, be really, really clear on what your subject is. And it's not hard, because it's always what has attracted you to take a photo. And quite often when I'm teaching is if someone says, well, come and have this photo I've taken, what do you think? And quite often if it's a really messy, busy scene, I'll say to them, well, what is your main subject? What has attracted you to take this photo? And then they'll point out the bit that they were actually attracted to. And then what happens is there's too many elements and too many things, and that one part gets lost. So you've got to really be clear on what your subject is, and then we use these techniques of recognizing elements and everything else, creating balance, to make that subject sort of really stand out. So yeah, once you've identified that, then the second thing is go through and identify all of the other elements that are in the frame. And we went through that right at the start. And I really, really encourage you all, if you want to sort of nail your compositions and tidy your compositions up, then just learn to break everything down into those elements and start recognizing what they are and how many you have. And just remember, not too many. The less you have, the more dynamic and striking your image is going to be. So then we've got our subject, we've got all of our elements. So now it's a matter of placement. So it's like, okay, how do we place these elements within the frame? And so by how we place them and where we place them will create balance. And one of the things with composition is, you would have heard of an image where people say, oh, it's a really well balanced image. So, and that's sort of a subconscious thing. It's subconscious. When you look at an image that's well balanced, it just sits well and you like it. Where when an image is unbalanced, you probably don't realize that it is unbalanced, but because it's unbalanced, it's sort of throwing you off. So placement of your elements is then really sort of critical. And what you can do is by being very specific with a placement of your camera angle and how you set that up, is you can actually create shapes. So like in here, I've used the sandy foreground of this image. I've set myself up as I've created a triangle shape. And I don't know why, but triangles are always good. They just really sort of work. And, you know, and here in this scenario, we've got a very strong triangle shape. In this situation, it becomes, you know, a line that really sort of pushes you into the image. Now, the other thing to create balance, I'm just going to quickly talk about 3 different things. So rule of thirds, space around your elements, and then placing your elements on a diagonal. So like with rule of thirds, don't ever think that it's, you know, what amateurs do, or it's not worth considering, because it really is. And you know, the other thing with rule of thirds is you don't have to apply by every rule. Like with this one, we have the main subject on the left-hand vertical third line, but I've got my horizon pretty well in the middle. So it doesn't always have to comply to every part of that rule, but you'll find that by placing elements on those thirds line, you are actually creating balance, because what you're doing is you're leaving space, you know, around those elements to make it all sit well. So quite often when I'm composing, I don't ever sort of look at it as and set things up as rule of thirds, but then when I finish composing, I'll look at it and go, yeah, that's rule of thirds. And it's just because it works. It really does. So the other thing is with your major elements is you really want to be critical about the space that you leave behind, that you leave around them. And this will have a big impact on balance. You don't want anything too tight to the edges. So even this third arrow, the highest arrow pointing to that rock sort of, you know, out in the ocean there, even though if we look at that as real estate, God, it's probably only 1% of the whole frame. But it's really important that that has a bit of space and it's not sort of really close to the edge. Any element that, little element like that is really close to one of your edges of your frame looks like it's falling out of the picture. And when things are too close, it's sort of like, well, you know, is it in or is it out? So always be very critical of space around those elements. And another thing I do is I place things on a diagonal quite a bit. So here we've got, you know, 2 very main large elements, and by placing them diagonally within the frame, then it really sort of helps balance that whole image out. I'll just show you, I've got a couple of examples of this. So again, with this one here, we're placing these 2 elements diagonally. And you'll also notice that they are roughly the same size in real estate value. So that also creates balance. You don't want that foreground one too big, or else it will sort of overpower. So by keeping those similar size, then it helps balance it out. And even on the opposite diagonal, we've got, you know, sort of almost negative space on those other 2 diagonals. So that helps create balance as well. And even stuff like this, even though our main subject is sort of sitting in the middle, then, you know, I've placed the rock on the left to work diagonally with it. And that can actually also become a line. So what it does is it links those 2 elements, and it sort of pushes, again, it pushes the viewer from one to the other. And I think this is the last one. So this was really critical with this image, that that I had something on the right-hand lower corner, because that rock on the left was so big and so sort of overpowering. If I just had water all on the left, then it would be very heavily weighted to that left-hand side. So again, I've included this rock on the right-hand bottom corner to really help sort of balance out that large element over on the left there. And this one here, again, we've just got 2 really main strong elements, and again, they're sitting diagonally across the frame to help create that balance. And that is it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dean. That was amazing, and a huge amount of information I learn a bunch of things as well, and particularly on how to work out what those elements are and try and limit those elements in your image even before you take a shot, I think is a great thing to learn. So yeah, that's really, really cool. Now, guys, we're just going to move on to some questions as well. If you've asked a question and it hasn't been answered yet, please feel free to turn on the microphone, turn on your camera, ask the question. If you've got a new question, jump on, ask it, please.
Hi, Dan. If you could only have 3 filters, which 3 would you buy?
6-stop ND, 10-stop ND, and a 3-stop medium graduated filter. So yeah, 6 and 10 ND, and then the 3-stop medium. They are the 3 that I would definitely use the most.
Yeah, thanks, Dan.
No worries. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, Dean.
Yep.
It's Ian here.
Ian.
Sorry, I turned this back on. Sorry about that. I didn't realise something. Sorry, something's happened to my video. But when you got irregular things like mountains or cliffs by the sea,
yep.
How do you then work it out with your graduated filter?
Like what graduated filters?
As in, if you've got a hard edge or something against the horizon, that's pretty straightforward. But you're actually got partly your filter is covering some of the mountain and then not the other part. It's not even, not like a nice straight line.
No, so with the mountain scene, you wouldn't, very rarely would you ever use a hard graduated filter. You'd be more using a soft or a medium, and you'll probably find the mediums are still fairly forgiving and you can pull them down. The other thing you can do is if you've got a cliff face on one side, it doesn't have to come straight down. You can rotate the holder as that it sort of comes say on a 30 or a 40 degree angle to sort of soften off the amount of graduated filter you're putting into the hillside. But yeah, you'll find with mountain scenes, you probably won't use hard grads because they just don't work when you don't have a dead straight horizon. They're definitely more suited to seascapes.
Right, yeah, thanks.
No worries.
Do you ever use a 6 and a 10 stop together?
Well, I've used a 10 and a 3, and as I say, I do actually have the 15 stop Nissi filter, so I would probably just use that one. Yeah, I don't think I've used a 10 and a 6, but I've certainly used a 10 and a 3 before. It works okay.
Yeah, I was just wondering because most of your images, I didn't see that combination. So I was just wondering if you had that in your arsenal.
Well, I have, but the only time I would ever shoot something that long or have that amount of ND would be, I mean, that's going to give you a really long exposure time. And with a seascape, the only advantage you're going to get from that is streaky clouds. So basically, if you shoot an ocean scene that's 30 seconds to 1 minute, it's milky. And if you shoot it at 10 minutes, it's still milky. It's no milkier. So there's no advantage as far as what's happening in the water. So the only time I really sort of look at doing, 4 minutes and onwards would be to create movement, from the clouds to create that real streakiness.
Yep. And Carl, you could also use a 10 stop instead of stacking as well. The 3 and 6 you mentioned is 9 stops. You could just increase your ISO from ISO 100 to 200, and that'll give you a very similar result.
Mm.
Yeah. Dean, a couple of quick people have asked, do you use a reverse grind at all?
No, I don't, because I find on a crop sensor, it doesn't feather out quick enough. So it's basically on the setup that I have on the Fuji, I find, especially because I'm only shooting 24mm, I'm not shooting ultra wide, but a lot of times it just really acts the same as a hard grad. So I don't use that a lot. If I was shooting more at 16mm and had a lot more sky, and then I'd probably find that I would use the hard grad a bit more. So again, I think that sort of depends on your camera setup a little bit. So people shooting a full frame Canon on with 16mm would probably find the reverse grad works really well on that. But personally, I find I just use the hard grad.
Dean, this is another question that was asked. Do you use a lens hood when you're shooting with filters?
A lens hood?
Yeah.
No.
Do you have to deal with glare very often?
Sometimes, if I'm shooting midday and the sun is overhead, then and maybe slightly in front of me, then I have had some issues, and I find just putting a cap, like the cap you've got on, and just put the cap on the top of the filters to stop it coming in. It's not very often, but you would just get you'll get some little flares. So that's really the only time. But 99% of the times I don't have any flare issues.
Yeah, I find if I get it, Dean, I just put my hand up like this.
Yeah.
When I'm taking my exposure, it works just like a lens hood, and I don't have to carry around the lens hood. The only time I ever find it is when I'm shooting in filtered light in a waterfall or something like that. Particularly if you're shooting up to get the waterfall and the light's coming from just above it. And the hand trick works really well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Any more questions? Any final questions?
Thanks, Dan.
No worries. Thank you, Kevin.
All right. Well, I might call it a night. I just want to say a huge thank you to Dean for an awesome presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us this week. Much appreciated taking time out of your night to log in and say hello and hear a little bit about photography and Nissi. So thank you so much. We'll see you hopefully next week with another presentation. Have a good night, everyone.
See you next year.
Yeah, see you, Kate.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dean.
Brilliant. No worries.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello, Lynn.
Good. Thank you, Dean.
No worries. Thanks, Carl.
Thank you, Dean.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, guys.
Yes,
Thank
thanks,
you.
Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew and Izzy.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Geez, you get a lot of comments in chat, don't you?
Yeah, heaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, tons.
Yeah.
Tons of some on YouTube as well. So.
Yeah.